age Christ and Alexander at death. But these are the two greatest figures in antiquity. So Jesus Christ and Alexander the Great, who are probably the same person anyway. But also St. Augustine said that if we all go to heaven, we all go to heaven age 33. There's no point going to heaven if you're a baby wearing a nappy. It'll be a waste of time. And it's no good going to heaven if you're an old person who can't see anymore. So St. Augustine said we all go to heaven age 33. And Eisenstein, the greatest filmmaker ever, loses his virginity in Mexico City age 33. So it's an examination not only of Eisenstein as a very great filmmaker, but about this extraordinary experience he had. I don't know, have you ever been to Mexico? You know, they play the Day of the Dead. They're very familiar with death. And there are only two subject matters, aren't there? One is sex and the other is death. What else is there to talk about? Nothing else to talk about. There's sex and death and non-negotiable. The very, very beginning and the very, very end. I don't know anything about you apart from two things. I know two people fucked to make you, unless you were conceived in a test tube, but even then, there's an indication that two people are responsible for your origins. And I'm sorry, but you're going to die. Only two things I know about you, and you, and you, and you, and you. And everything else is negotiable. Everything else is negotiable. But you can't avoid the very beginning, and you can't avoid the very end. So in a sense, these are the only two subject matters I'd like to talk about.
What about Rembrandt that we saw yesterday night? So in Rembrandt, you've got a character that's a bit like in The Belly of an Architect. I mean, that's an artist, and he's got some kind of disease. Well, he's afraid about his eyes, like the other one is afraid about his belly. And this is like coming back very often in your cinema.
Yeah, it's this sort of, you know the story of Faust. You know, you have to play with the devil. You have to make a contract with the devil. And I think that I'm trying to write a novel now called The Man in Red, which is related to one of the figures in The Night Watch. Rembrandt has a very, very unhappy personal life. He had 3 consorts. There were 3 women in his life, and they all died before he did. And he had 7 children, and they all died before he did. So you can imagine, in terms of sort of domesticity and human relations, although he ended up with a huge reputation, was a very great painter, he had to suffer from a very miserable domestic life. So maybe that's, you know, this is, you know, Holland is a Calvinist country, and, you know, Calvinists believe in notions of punishment, and, you know, you're not here to be happy. I mean, I think Calvinism is extremely stupid, but that's what the Dutch believe in. So he's an absolute exemplar of the Calvinist way of life. He had to suffer in order to be successful.
And how did you choose to go to Holland?
How did me?
Yeah.
Oh, you don't want to know about it. It's a huge, long story. I tell you very, very briefly. My father was an ornithologist, and he built bird reservations. And the bird reservations, you probably know about Holland. It's virtually all sea, so it's a mixture of fresh water and salt water. So it's on the migratory bird route from Scandinavia down to Spain, and there are huge numbers of birds fly over Holland in the spring and in the autumn. And my father, who was very, very keen on ornithology and examination of bird life, actually built reservations in Holland for the observation of birds. And when I was a child, I spent huge amounts of time in the marshes and the beaches of Holland, so I grew very, very familiar with that landscape. So that's the beginning. But then I wanted to be a landscape painter, and the best landscape painters in the world are Dutch. So I spent a lot of time in Amsterdam and Rotterdam studying Dutch painting. And then at art school in the swinging 60s in London, that big, very fertile time that saw people like David Hockney and the Beatles and all that phenomenon, was very, very fertile for this multimedia thing I'm talking about. So you went to art school, but you probably spent more time making music and making films than you did making paintings. So it was a very, very useful time. And then the Rotterdam Film Festival discovered me around about, I think, about 1976. And I made a lot of very experimental short films, films that you've mentioned. And they were all shown for the first time in continental Europe in Rotterdam. So my connections with Holland were very, very strong. And now I live there because I have a producer who looks after all the film finance and all the logistics. and he's sort of like my sugar daddy, I suppose. All I have to do is come up with a new script, and he basically finds the money for it, and we go into production. And this has been going now on for about 18 years. So it makes a lot of good sense for me to live in Holland.
How is it for the very first film you made? How did you come to make films? So you learn more.
Well, the very, very
more
first
painting.
film I made was called Death the Sentiment, and I was using a camera like that. And all the actors in it were all my fellow students, art students in London around about 1963. I was 21, 63, so I came of age in 1963. The same time that the Beatles produced Magical Mystery Tour. I don't know, you're probably not a Beatles fan, so it's all in the past for you, isn't it? But for me, of course, it's, I live parallel with all this stuff. So I made, films just like you're filming me now, and very, very simple and primitive for virtually no money. And then gradually I made more and more and more and more short films, and I became a film editor inside the British film industry. And they began to win prizes, and they were shown around Europe and the UK. And then people started giving me small sums of money to make longer and longer and longer films. We have an institution in London called the BFI, the British Film Institute, and they were in the business to support young filmmakers. And very, very slowly, I must have made about 40 short little tiny films, anywhere between 5 minutes and half an hour, and gradually built up a reputation. And then I made a film called The Draftsman's Contract. It's called something completely different here, in a different title. And that really was the breakthrough. It was an enormous success in France, critically and also financially. And really still, that has remained my calling card. That is the first breakthrough film. Relevant to the zeitgeist.
Did you consider yourself as a filmmaker?
Much admired by intellectual French, a very cerebral film. And all the other movies have followed on ever since. Then my biggest American success was The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover, which did very, very well in America. And it's not so difficult now to finance films. Each film we make, I suppose, budgeted about 5 million euros, which is not very expensive. If we started having bigger budgets, I'd lose control, because I always get director's cut. So what you see is what I want. So nobody else interferes. And I think if the budgets got any bigger, we would lose that control.
Did you consider yourself as a film director before you had the success? Because
I still don't think of myself as a film director. No.
So how do you think about yourself? Like,
well,
who do you think?
Do I have to? Do I have to find
No, not really. I mean, do you consider yourself?
My first love is painting. I think
that's what I mean.
The greatest philosophical discourse is conducted in painting, and has been ever since the Renaissance. So I like always to be associated with the activity of a painter. Because the painter has found for himself or herself a curious independence. Like, it's all your own fault. So if it's a failure, it's only your fault. If it's a success, it's only your success. So the painter has had to work very, very hard to find his position in the world. And now, Aslam Kiefer, Andy Warhol, Richard Rauschenberg, they've reached the top of a permissible way in which they can really pursue their own imagination like nobody else can. I mean, even writers don't have that sort of freedom. So it's a very enviable position to be in. So I always feel, maybe this sounds a bit pompous, but I always feel that, essentially I'm still a painter, but I just happen to be working in cinema.
So you did painting in frames and moving frames?
Yes, one of my early disciplines was as a mural painter, and mural painters paint large anyway, so the notion of the screen didn't become such an extraordinary new jump.
You also be like an architect.
Well, again, if I were to believe in reincarnation and was allowed to come down again, which of course I don't, I would like to come down next time as an architect. Because architecture is the mother of all the arts.
So you'd have enjoyed being an architect?
It's about space, space and time. I think the very, very best cinema deals in space and time.
And so you were talking, since you arrived, about the future of cinema, and you were...
Well, you've heard me complaining. You've heard me complaining about, we have a very boring cinema now, but I do have a fantastic optimism about what's going to happen next. And I think it's a political situation as well as an aesthetic one. And it's to do with equality and a greater democracy in notions of how we purvey, organize and distribute culture.
So for you, cinema is dead?
Yes, and as I repeatedly said, I give you a date. It's the 31st of September 1983, when the zapper, or the remote control, was introduced into the living rooms of the world. Suddenly, you don't have passive entertainment anymore. It becomes interactive.
So, but why do you still make films then?
Because I'm a stupid old fossil, and because I've given so many opportunities. You know, I make operas and theatres and websites and VGA shows. I still paint and have painting exhibitions. In that sense, I'm incredibly privileged. You know, I can pick and take from any media, and I can transmogrify, I can morphize one media into another thanks to modern technology. So I'm going to use all these privileges and see and be excited about the notion of producing things, of making things, of you know, exciting other imaginations. And I shall go on doing that for as long as the privileges last.
Well, we've got a lot of youngsters here, well, in cinema studies. What would you advise them? Well,
I would say forget cinema, because it's now finished, and concentrate on the new media, which is primarily, of course, to do with your laptop, and the communications that are now possible with amazing new technology and extraordinary ability to communicate with everybody in the world, which has never ever happened before.
But is it not a bit individualistic? Like,
well, I don't know, you know, do we need Stravinsky? Do we need Picasso? Do we need Corbusier anymore? You know, the French have been talking for a long time now about the death of the author. Do we need that subjective imagination? When we all become empowered, you know, we don't need these people anymore.
But the function of cinema is also social. For instance, you get a screen, so like for theatre, you get people coming and everybody is in the same room and coming together and talking about the same thing, and they go and...
Well, I'm not so sure about this. You know, people reckon that cinema is a social activity, but I don't think it is. When you come into a darkened cinema, if you're going to concentrate on the screen, you have a one-to-one relationship with that screen. And everybody else disappears. They disappear from your worldview. So that notion of one-to-one doesn't really make the cinema a social activity. I mean, going to a football match is very, very social. I think even going to the theatre, because the theatre is a three-dimensional experience, you know, there's only one good seat in any cinema, and it's about G13. It's right in the middle, because that's the position in which the cameraman took the pictures. So all the other seats, in a curious way, are not as good as that. But you wouldn't say that about the theatre or the opera house. You know, most opera houses are built in a horseshoe shape, so all the seats are good because you're watching a three-dimensional experience, even if everybody sees it slightly differently. Mind you, these horseshoe shapes were basically created in Italy mainly, but also in Germany, because when people went to the opera, they weren't really very interested in what went on the stage. The audience came to see the audience. So there's an ideal way. It was a big, it's in a curious way, it's like Avatar. It's an event. It's not a performance, it's an event.
Right, and what about the projects? So you talk about pornography?
Well, you know, there are many, many projects. I think we were talking the other night, I think we have 26 projects at the moment on the go. Exhibitions, films, television, websites, VJing. There's a lot of activity. But you know what they say about artists, that basically they only make one work. And in a sense, it all comes together as one phenomenon. A bit like writing a book. The chapters aren't necessarily put together in the right order, and maybe only afterwards, when the whole thing is completed, along will come people to sort it all out. So there's enormous amounts of interconnection. You know, if I argue there are only two subject matters, one sex and the other death, all my cinema is about sex and death, over and over and over again. But you know, here in France, there were two Renoirs. There was the Renoir who was the painter, and the Renoir who was the son.
Filmmaker.
And one day, the son filmmaker said to the painter father, "Okay, Dad, I want to make films, but I've got nothing to say." And the father advised the son, "Don't worry, most artists probably have only one or two ideas in their whole life, and they continually repeat and repeat and repeat those ideas all the way through. But don't worry about that, because most people don't have any ideas at all. So 2 ideas is more than enough to last you a lifetime. And if one of those ideas is sex, and the other idea is death, huge subject matters which you can never stop talking about.
But how do you do to find actor who accept to act nu?
Naked.
Naked.
For the pornographic.
It is.
All
I
right.
mean, in the past, you know, I've worked with some extraordinary actors and actresses, people like Helen Mirren and people like John Gielgud and so on. So, you know, they're first-class actors and actresses. But it's known that if you sign a contract with Peter Greenaway, you probably have to take your clothes off. It's part of the contract. But, you know, we can laugh about that, but what actors and actresses really like is to be pushed, really pushed, because that act of giving a performance is really about the sort of notion of what actors and actresses do. You know, open up the envelope. So if that requires you have to fuck on stage, well then, as long as the circumstances are creditable and the notions of exploitation are not too excessive, though I think it's naive to pretend that in some senses, of course, all actors are exploited because that's the nature of their profession.
Do actors
Then
actually
they will
fuck?
go along with it.
But do they actually fuck, or is that like not shown?
Well, they're going to
and-
fuck certainly in this pornography.
Well,
You're going
of
to
course.
see it. You know, we've often simulated copulation before, but I mean that's normal. But I don't know. Have you seen a movie like? Have you seen Prospero's Books? You know, everybody's naked all the way through in that. But there isn't a particular. I would like to think, and I think audience responses have indicated that. You know, the exploitation, so-called, is legitimate and creditable and honourable because it's all part of the phenomenon that is part of what the movie's about.
You have taken, you have said that we wanted to do 3 movies, and we have talked about 2 movies. What is the first?
Well, I have six scripts. I now have, as of tomorrow morning, there are 6 scripts ready to film. But, you know, it takes about 9 months, human gestation period, to make a movie. So it takes as long to make a baby as it does to make a film. So, you know, these have to be done. You can't all make them at once on a time, so you have to work out an agenda and a schedule. But the first feature film will be Goltzius, which is this pornography. The next film after that will be shot in Mexico, which is about Eisenstein. And I've now recently, very, very recently, I actually have it in my luggage here to work on the plane when I came to this city, a new script about my enthusiasm for Vivaldi, the Italian composer, in association with Botero. I've just come back from Colombia where we had a big exhibition about Botero. So this is really the unlikely relationship between Botero and Vivaldi.
So in most of your films there is, well, there's sex, there is death, but there is also art.
Indeed, you know, again, we rely on sex and death for the absolutely non-negotiables, but how are we going to spend our time here profitably on Earth? I think probably the best thing to do is to make art. What could be more satisfactory? You know, religions change virtually every week, and politics change every afternoon, but there's a continuity about art and culture, which is always running by as a stream. You know, if you take the artifacts of ancient Egypt, you know, in Egypt they believed in reincarnation and they worshipped the sun. Now, we think this is ridiculous, but we still regard their art as valuable. So we ignore their politics, we ignore their religion, but their art is still valuable, even though we don't necessarily understand it in the way that they did. So there's a continuity about cultural artifacts and cultural performance which will always be with us. Let me repeat, you know, religion and sex go out of the window very, very quickly.
There are a lot of sex in the Lars von Trier's work. What do you think about this film?
I don't go to the cinema, so I haven't seen a Lars film now for probably about 10 years. But Lars, who I'm quite friendly with, asked me to make a dogma film. But I refused because I want more language, not less language, because you know how they're very stripped down. He's a curious character. I mean, I think one of the films I like most of all, have you ever seen the film called Europa, Europa, which was a very early film he made? But he's tended to deny all that now. He doesn't want to be associated with it, which I find very, very strange. You know, I suppose along with Almodovar, these are the only two real auteurs left in Europe now. Who else is there? Everybody else is gone, or is basically making Hollywood movies. I mean, when I first started making films, you know, the Nouvelle Vague is not a historical phenomenon for me. It's a situation that was exactly contemporary with me. I think Godard is only, I think only 6 months older than me, so in a sense I'm contemporary of these people. It's not a historical phenomenon. And maybe even more important for me, it was the middle period of Italian cinema, which was so brilliant. I suppose maybe from La Dolce Vita to The Last Emperor, that large section of 15 years, which really produced, and here are two Italians here, some of the greatest cinema ever made. It contains all those amazing Italian classics. People I admire enormously, of course Fellini, but also Pasolini and Olmi and Antonioni, really amazing names in cinema imagination. All gone now. What have you done? What have you done to destroy Italian cinema? You and Mr. Berlusconi, I think, are responsible. But I mean, you know, French cinema is pretty pathetic now too, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, where's the glory days of French cinema? You have these amazing directors, you know, Godard and Chabrol and Rivette and René. It's live, these people, aren't they? But they don't seem to be making any interesting movies anymore.
No past.
I think, you know, it's part of a malaise, you know, as I've been saying before. You know, the notion of European art movie is now essentially dead, it's gone, and the rest of cinema is going down the same drain. I think it's, you know, economic, political circumstances as much as aesthetic. We're just a different people now, and we don't have the same requirements and the same desires, you know, as people certainly did have in the 60s and 70s and early 80s.
So what do you see, well, how do you think it will be in about 100 years?
Well, I think the screen's not going to die. You know, though cinema might die, the screen, you know, not only is your camera looking at me, but there are probably surveillance cameras here, I'm sure, all looking at us. You know, we're all being screened all the time. When you go to the shopping mall or you go to the restaurant at lunchtime, you know, they're all down the street, all crossroads shops, chemists, post offices, the screens looking at us. We are incredibly well documented. That's going to increase and increase and increase and increase. And obvious things, I think, you know, we're all going to end up with chips in our brains, so we don't have phenomena like this camera. You know, we automatically will film everything. Our memories will become, you know, super, super powerful. And all the characteristics that we understand by the cinematic imagination, they'll all increase and increase and increase. You know, I'm sure laptops will disappear and it'll all be voice controlled. You know, we're probably, you know, the laptop will be this size and we can manipulate it. So miniaturization of everything is going to increase and increase and increase. Mind you, that's if, you know, the progress that we're now associated with in the West still continues. When Christianity completely goes, there's going to be a vacuum. Is Islam going to fill? You know, is your next, you know, the president of France probably in 30 years' time will probably be Islamic. You know, Notre Dame will be turned into a mosque. You know, that's a likely scenario that could very easily change. The fundamentalism of Islam is so incredibly powerful. Mind you, I think as more and more young Islamic people are educated, they'll begin to realize that it's a total and absolute brainwash and will gradually, you know, erode it away, corrode it away. So in all the absurdities of the Islamic religion, which are now being practiced in the world, I suppose 2 generations, and I think and I hope that most of it will have disappeared.
You mentioned the new media. What do you think about the graphic arts with Photoshop, for example?
Well, you know, I made a comment yesterday about Eisenstein talking about Disney, about, you know, the essence of starting of a movie essentially from nothing. And Photoshop is absolutely ideal for that. You know, I'd really like making movies without using a camera at all and just make it all on the screen. And we're continually making movies like that. And I suppose there eventually, you know, we'll be able to recreate Marilyn Monroe out of her DNA. So we won't use actors ever again. You know, there'll be no space for Sharon Stone anymore, because we can completely refabulate these people and build them up via Photoshop and its equivalents.
So what do you make
There's
film
a
of
lot,
Marilyn
you know,
Monroe?
I mean, you know that things like Shrek, which I don't actually think is a cartoon, is it? It's not really a cartoon. It's using graphics to reproduce reality, which is not what cartoons are about. But that sort of ability to manufacture an image in association with all. I mean, have you seen the new 3D movie, not Avatar,
Alice's Adventures in Wonderland?
Yes.
the Tim Burton movie? You know,
Alice au Pays des
the
Merveilles.
future of cinema, I think, will move more and more in that Tim Burton way. You know, how Alice is very much a combination of animation, real action, huge amounts of green screening, and that'll be the way, I think, certainly maybe for the next 20 years, that commercial cinema will push and push and push. And however much we, you know, feel unhappy about Avatar, very, very stupid movie, crippled American ex-Marine saves the universe. How banal can you get? Young people, certainly younger than you, I have a daughter aged 8, she's very excited about 3D movies, and that demand will create more and more and more of this. So we're going to have to travel a long way down this 3D road now. That's the next gimmick of cinema.
And what are the...
But it's not going to change cinema because, you know, Avatar as a film is very old-fashioned. And it really, you know, fulfills a scenario which was part of cinema, you know, 80, 90, 100 years ago.
What are the last movies you've seen?
I don't go to the cinema very often because I find it very boring. I mean, would it surprise you that actual last time I went to a movie house and paid for a ticket and sat in the dark would be way back, something like David Lynch's Blue Velvet, which must be 15, 18 years ago. But I know more about cinema than you do, because I have to. But I'm looking at cinema in bits and pieces. You know, I look at it on snips, of huge, huge numbers of picture researchers and casting people. I need to know about new actors. I need to know about technology. But I'm picking it up very, very piecemeal, I think, you know, through television means rather through straight cinema way.
And what about mobile phones?
Sorry?
What about mobile phones?
Yeah, you know, like you, I imagine, you know, I'm always on a mobile phone. It's vibrating in my pocket this very minute, so it's part of, you know, it's part of the environment we all live in now.
So the new cinema for you?
Well, like I said, you're giving me $2 million to make deliberately, you know, a movie on this small screen, which in itself is very exciting, because I obviously can't make Avatar on here, it's just not going to work. But I also can't make a conventional movie, because I'm going to have to make it very, very episodic. So each episode is probably going to only last maybe 2 minutes. So if I'm going to make a feature film, I've got to fragment a movie up so that it's recordable, so that it can be downloaded, so that, you know, you can watch the movie when you're having your early morning shit, for example, or when you're waiting for the tram or the bus. You'll pick up the second episode, the 33 episode. So click, 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 click. I probably can't make pornography, because if you're an old lady standing by the tram stop and you're watching pornography on your handset, that's going to cause all sorts of curious embarrassments and consternations. And then actually in sheer physical terms, I can't use wide shots because we've got a little tiny screen, so the new conventions are going to be full of big close-ups and probably medium shots, because you're never going to see distant horizons on a thing like this. It's vibrating now. There is a way in which I can't use maximum contrast, because I'm going to have to see this, not in a dark space like this, but when I'm waiting for a tram, it's going to be bright sunlight. So I've got to be able to make a picture that can be seen in bright sunlight. So you can see how the nature of the technology, what we were saying this afternoon, well, here this morning, in fact, we're going to have to change the language to suit the circumstances of the media. And that's very interesting, because it sets up all sorts of interesting problems that have to be solved. The script is ready, the retailing processes are ready, and also I've got to have to think about it, you know, how long does it stay on here? So we will say, look, you know, episode 33 of this new movie, it's going to be called 4 Storms, 2 Babies. I won't bother to explain why it's like that, but that's what it's called. 4 Storms, 2 Babies. And I would say that, you know, episode 33, Two Babies, is available for 10 days. Download it now, because in 10 days' time it'll vanish and you'll lose the continuity. So it needs, as you can see, new distribution system, new aesthetics, new demonstration of how to make pictures. So it's the beginnings of a whole new technology. And as soon as somebody starts making successful movies on these, you won't be coming to cinemas anymore. It'll be, you know, movies in your pocket. You know, the DVD is about to disappear, isn't it? You know, we're all going to download everything off the computer, so the whole DVD technology is going to very rapidly disappear. And all the complaints that Madonna had about being ripped off in music is now going to be ripped off in the whole cinematic world. But there's no way at all we're going to be able to police that, so we have to give that up. You know, filmmakers complaining about being ripped off is a total irrelevance. You're going to find some other way to make the money to finance it. Because there's no way you're going to be able to police this. But there is an alarming phenomenon happening now, isn't it? For 10 years now, it seems as though the internet has not been policed. But you know the problems of censorship in China. But it's not just China, it's the whole of the Far East. It's even places like Australia now. Australian internet is deeply, deeply policed. And soon there'll be ways, you know, of manipulating it. So you can imagine political parties can use the internet to squash the opposition. And there are some possible terrifying uses of the internet closing down and closing down and closing down and becoming, you know, very, very policed very shortly, which will be great disappointment. So no, maybe now, this very moment, we're living in the golden age of the internet, and it won't last forever.
All right, so we'll have to find something else after this.
Well, there always, I mean, you know, human ingenuity, always find something else, always find something else. You know, there's that phrase, the criminal is always ahead of the police.
Right.
And the censorship, you know, never happens with a new media, because people don't understand how powerful the new media is until it's established. And when it's established, then the police move in.
All right, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Okay, I'm going to take